President Trump reviving a controversial travel ban from his first term. The president signing a new proclamation blocking entry to the U.S. from 12 countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, Somalia. And that ban goes into effect Monday at midnight. Travelers from 7 other countries also facing those heightened restrictions. Joining us now is international law professor Milena Stereo to break this all down. Milena, so good to see you. It seemed as though the first time around this ban was enacted almost immediately. And I remember going out to Dulles International Airport, or one big of our international airports here, and just the chaos that ensued with so many of these arriving flights, etc. This is going to give a little bit of a buffer until Monday, which begs the question. Now you got to wait until those potential claims and lawsuits start to be filed. But I imagine that there's going to be a lot of work here come Sunday night.
No, absolutely, there will be. As you mentioned, there's now a ban on arrivals from individuals coming from a total of 12 countries, and there are partial restrictions for 7 additional countries. Now, if you remember from the previous Trump administration, there had also been a ban put in place, and there were conversations and some litigation around whether the ban was discriminatory, because it seemed at the time that most countries that were on the list under the first Trump administration were Muslim countries, and so folks talked about the so-called Muslim ban. This time around, the countries vary. Some of them are predominantly Muslim countries, but some are not. It does seem, when you look at this grouping of countries, it does seem that most of these countries have frosty or adversarial relations with the United States. The Trump administration is claiming that individuals from these countries have a tendency to overstay their visas in the United States and that they pose a national security threat. It is also fair to say, though, that these are countries where the United States typically does not issue a lot of visas. So this ban will not actually affect millions of individuals. It will affect a small cohort of individuals who would have otherwise been able to request a visa to come to the United States. But again, these are countries from which we typically admit a relatively small number of individuals.
Right. Countries like Iran and Cuba, the administration saying in this order they don't have the ability to produce these visas, to vet the people, and therefore this is why we're applying this. To your point on the overstayed visas, they say that they've got the data, that a lot of these countries have people who overstay those visas, and that is why those countries have now been applied to this ban. I imagine that there will be at least emergency injunctions come on Monday to pause much of this. But what else is the government going to have to prove up against some of these plaintiffs?
Well, the way that this works in litigation is that it's actually the plaintiffs that are going to have to prove that somehow the presidential executive action is unconstitutional. And the typical grounds are going to be things like, for example, discrimination, or the president is exceeding his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. These are typically areas, though, where presidents have a lot of leeway, where courts are typically unwilling to step in and check the executive. So absent some showing by the potential plaintiffs that this is somehow discriminatory, that it's targeted, for example, only against individuals of Muslim faith, etc., I think it's going to be fairly difficult for plaintiffs to prevail here. But I do anticipate, as you mentioned, that there will be litigation over this.
And I guess how different, and you're right, it's the plaintiffs having to prove the case here, but obviously the government is going to have to go up against the courts, right? Because we had seen last time around in that first generation of the travel ban, if you were, that there were like multiple iterations of said travel ban because the courts kept saying, you can't do this, this is unconstitutional, etc. What could be some of those roadblocks for the government come, other than, say, discrimination that the plaintiffs may claim?
Yeah, so the government has to demonstrate that the president is acting constitutionally, that the president is acting in an area where the Constitution says that the executive branch can act. And again, typically the areas where the president can act are issues of national security. If there's a national security issue, national emergency. So the Trump administration is going to have to say, look, these are countries where individuals coming in from them pose a threat to the United States, whether it be because they're overstaying their visas in the United States, but also, as you mentioned, because when it comes to some of these countries, they're governed by so-called failed regimes that don't have any effective control. And so part of the allegations of the Trump administration is that those governments, such as, for example, Somalia or Haiti, they're not functioning properly. As a result, they cannot vet the individuals who are applying for these visas to the United States. So those would typically be arguments that the government would advance to justify these travel bans.
Well, we know the president saying that he decided upon this after the attack out in Boulder, Colorado. We know the suspect in that case is Egyptian. Egypt not on that travel ban list, but I imagine that won't play into the legal war here that's about to ensue. Milena, as always, thank you so much for helping us and break that down.
Of course.